Ethan buys a duplex. Ryan opens a brokerage account and clicks one button. 5 years later, one of them looks like he's winning by a mile. 20 years later, the scoreboard tells a story neither of them expected. Because the question isn't which one builds wealth. They both build wealth. The question is which one builds it faster, and the answer depends on something nobody factors into the math when they start. Let's keep this fair. Ethan and Ryan are 30 years old. They both make $70,000 a year. They both have $60,000 saved. Same city, same tax bracket, same starting point. The only difference is what they do with the $60,000 on a Wednesday morning in March. Ethan buys a $300,000 duplex. He puts $60,000 down. That's 20%. He takes a 30-year mortgage at 7.2%. His monthly payment, principal and interest, comes in around $1,630. He lives in one unit and rents the other for $1,400 a month. House hacking, the strategy real estate people swear by. On paper, his housing cost just dropped by $1,400 a month. His friends are impressed. His parents are proud. The realtor calls him a savvy investor in a follow-up email and asks him to leave a Google review. He does. 5 stars. Ryan takes the same $60,000 and dumps it into a total market index fund. He sets up an automatic transfer of $500 a month from his checking account. He picks an expense ratio of 0.03% and never thinks about it again. His parents ask him what he bought. He says, the whole market. They ask him to be more specific. He can't, because there isn't a more specific answer. His friends don't ask him anything. There is no story here. There is no key. There is no tenant. There is a confirmation email and a number that goes up and down for the rest of his life. Day 1, Ethan looks like the smart one. By every social and emotional metric available, he is. He owns property. Ryan owns a screen. Year 1. Ethan's tenant pays on time, mostly. There was a late payment in March that turned into a tense text exchange and an awkward apology. Ethan's water heater dies in July at 11:47 p.m. on a Sunday. The tenant calls. Ethan drives over. The plumber charges $1,400 because it's an emergency call. The tenant complains about the dishwasher in November. It's still working. Ethan replaces it anyway because the lease is up in 3 months and he can't afford another vacancy. That's another $700. He's claiming mortgage interest and depreciation on his taxes. He gets back about $2,800 more than he otherwise would. The math in his head still works. Ryan's portfolio went from $60,000 to about $66,000, plus his $6,000 in contributions. So $72,000. He logged in twice. He didn't do anything either time. There was nothing to do. Year 3. Ethan's tenant moves out. He hires a property manager because the last vacancy lost him 2 months of rent and he can't go through that again. The manager takes 9% of monthly rent. That's $126 a month, or $1,512 a year. Property taxes have risen by 4%. Insurance is up by 11%. The roof inspection flagged 2 soft spots. He's putting $4,000 aside for next year, conservatively. His total out-of-pocket on this property over 3 years, after all rent collected and tax savings claimed, is somewhere around negative $4,000. Meaning he's down $4,000 on cash flow. He still tells people the property cash flows. Technically, on a good month, it does. Ryan's portfolio is at roughly $98,000. He spent 0 hours on it. His coworker asked him for stock tips. He said he doesn't pick stocks. The coworker thinks he's being modest. He isn't. Now here is where most YouTube videos stop. Most videos run the math through year 3, declare a winner, and roll credits. But the gap at year 3 is not the story. The gap at year 3 is the trailer. The actual movie starts now. Year 5. The HVAC unit dies on a Tuesday in August. The tenant texts at 6:14 a.m. The unit, replaced, costs $7,800. Ethan didn't have $7,800 set aside. He had about $4,000 in his CAPEX reserve, which he thought was conservative. It wasn't. He puts the rest on a credit card at 22% and pays it off over 4 months. His tax savings that year cover about half of it. He also dealt with a tenant turnover in spring. 1 month vacant, $1,400 in lost rent, $900 in cleaning and repainting, $300 in listing fees. After 5 years, the property is worth roughly $345,000. His total equity is around $90,000 once you account for mortgage paydown. His friends still ask about the property. He still says it's going great. He's not lying. He's just not running the full numbers out loud. Ryan's portfolio is at $138,000. The market dropped 22% in year 4 for about 6 months. Ryan didn't sell. He read one Vanguard blog post that said, "Stay the course," set his phone face down for a week, and the portfolio recovered everything within 9 months. He has now done 2 things in 5 years. Set up the account and not panicked. That is the entire job description. Year 7. Ethan refinances. Rates dropped, briefly, and he locked in 5.9%. His monthly payment went down by $190. He celebrates. His property has appreciated to about $380,000. His equity, after refinancing costs, is around $115,000. He has been a landlord for 7 years. He has fielded 41 maintenance calls, dealt with 3 different tenants, and taken 1 full week of vacation in 5 years because the property kept needing him. He wants to buy a second one. He doesn't have the down payment yet. The first property is supposed to be funding the second. It isn't. Ryan's portfolio is at $185,000. He's been making $500 contributions for 7 years. He raised it to $700 last year because he got a bonus. The portfolio doesn't care. The portfolio just compounds. He's now generating more in unrealized gains every year than his original salary contribution. He realizes this on a Tuesday and stares at the screen for a few minutes. He doesn't tell anyone. There is nothing to tell. The number went up. It went up because it always goes up over long enough timelines, and he isn't doing anything to make it happen except not selling. Here is where the curves diverge in a way the first 3 years completely hide. Ethan's wealth is growing linearly. Each year the property appreciates a bit, the mortgage gets paid down a bit, the rent goes up a bit, and the costs go up a bit. The slope is constant. Slow, predictable, real, but constant. Ryan's wealth is growing exponentially. Every year, his returns compound on a larger base. The slope is bending upward. At year 7, Ryan is barely ahead. At year 10, the lines cross meaningfully. By year 15, the gap is structural. Year 10. Ethan's first property is worth around $410,000. His mortgage balance is $182,000. His equity is $228,000. He finally buys the second property at year 9. He puts $50,000 down on a $250,000 condo. The numbers on the second property are tighter than the first. Rates are higher. Cash flow is barely positive. He now manages 2 assets. His weekends are partially booked, permanently. His total equity across both properties is around $290,000. That's real wealth. It came from leverage, appreciation, and a decade of his time. Ryan's portfolio is at $310,000. He has spent 0 weekends on it. He has fielded 0 phone calls. He has had 0 awkward conversations about late rent. He raised his contribution to $1,000 a month 2 years ago because he got a promotion. The portfolio just absorbed the new money and kept compounding. At year 10, Ryan is ahead by about $20,000. That gap is small. That gap is not the point. The point is that Ryan's wealth is sitting on a curve that bends upward, and Ethan's is sitting on a curve that bends roughly nowhere. The rent check is the number every real estate guru talks about. The rent check is the thumbnail. The rent check is what your buddy at the barbecue brags about. What nobody talks about is everything that comes out of that rent check before you actually keep any of it. The average landlord spends 40 to 60 hours per year per property on management, repairs, tenant communication, paperwork, and emergencies. That sounds modest until you stack it across 2 or 3 properties in 20 years. That's 2,400 to 3,600 hours of unpaid work. At your hourly rate, that's a number worth knowing. Most people don't want to know. Concentration. Ethan's wealth is in 2 buildings on 2 streets in one city. If that city loses a major employer, if a flood hits, if zoning changes, his net worth takes the hit alone. Ryan owns roughly 4,000 companies across 60 countries. The diversification math isn't a slogan. It's the difference between recovering from a regional shock and not. Liquidity. Ethan can't sell half a property. He can sell one or none. Selling takes 60 to 90 days, costs 6 to 8% in transaction fees, and triggers capital gains unless he 1,031s into another property and starts the cycle over. Ryan can sell exactly $4,200 of his portfolio at 9:47 a.m. on a Wednesday and have the money in his account before lunch. Tenant risk. One bad tenant who stops paying and knows the eviction process can cost 6 months of lost rent plus legal fees. That single event can erase 2 years of profit. There is no equivalent risk on the index side. The market doesn't squat in your spare bedroom. Property tax creep. Property taxes don't stay flat. They follow the assessed value of the property, which usually rises faster than rent does. Across 20 years, the cost of holding the property has been quietly outrunning the income from it. Scale. This is the one nobody runs the numbers on. When Ryan has an extra $1,000 a month to deploy, he just adds it to the portfolio. The cost of deploying capital is zero. When Ethan has an extra $1,000 a month, he can't buy a third of a duplex. He has to wait until he has another $40,000 to $60,000 saved, find another property, get another mortgage, take on another set of management headaches, and accept that the new property will probably cash flow worse than the first. Real estate doesn't scale linearly with capital. It scales in lumpy, expensive, time-intensive chunks. Index funds scale in a single click. By year 15, the gap is not subtle anymore. Ethan's 2 properties are worth a combined $720,000. His mortgage balances total $290,000. His equity is around $430,000. He has 8 more years of payments before the first one is paid off, and he is exhausted. He has thought about selling at least a dozen times. He hasn't, because every time he runs the numbers, the capital gains tax and transaction costs make him hesitate. Ryan's portfolio is at $640,000. He raised contributions to $1,500 a month. He has spent 0 hours managing it. He has had exactly 1 moment of panic in 2008 when the portfolio dropped 38% in a few months. He didn't sell. He has now had 2 crashes and 0 panic sells. Most retail investors panic sell during crashes and buy back in after the recovery, locking in losses. Ryan didn't, because he never opened the app. If I only showed you the downsides of real estate, I'd be doing what every index fund evangelist does. Real estate has real advantages. Pretending it doesn't is dishonest. Leverage. Ryan used $60,000 to control $60,000. Ethan used $60,000 to control $300,000. That 5-to-1 ratio is enormous when prices rise. In a hot market, Ethan's appreciation isn't on his $60,000. It's on the entire $300,000. That's the single biggest reason real estate has minted more millionaires than the stock market in many surveys. The leverage is real, and it's hard to replicate elsewhere without taking on margin loans most retail investors shouldn't touch. Force savings. The mortgage forces Ethan to build equity whether he wants to or not. Ryan has to choose to invest every month. Most people don't. Most people see the brokerage account and treat it like an emergency fund and a vacation fund and an I deserve this fund. Real estate removes the choice from the equation, and that's a feature, not a bug, for people who don't trust their own discipline. Tax magic. Depreciation lets real estate investors write down a building that's actually appreciating in value. That's a paper loss against real income. Combined with a 1031 exchange, capital gains can be deferred indefinitely until death, at which point the cost basis steps up and the heirs inherit it tax-free. The stock market has no equivalent strategy outside of retirement accounts with annual contribution caps. None. House hacking. Ethan lived in one unit of the duplex for the first 3 years. His effective housing cost was negative for most of that time. Ryan paid full rent the whole way. That's $40,000 to $60,000 in housing costs Ryan ate that Ethan didn't. The brokerage account doesn't let you live inside it. Real estate isn't a bad investment. It's a misunderstood one. It rewards a specific kind of person doing it for a specific reason in a specific market. It punishes everyone else. Year 20. Ethan's 2 properties are worth a combined $920,000. His mortgages are mostly paid off. His equity is approximately $780,000. He has been collecting rent for 2 decades. After every real cost across both properties, taxes, insurance, capital expenditures, vacancies, management fees, the cash flow he actually pocketed totals somewhere between $90,000 and $140,000 across 20 years. Plus the equity. He worked for that money. He earned it the hard way. The number is real. Ryan's portfolio at 20 years, with contributions that grew from $500 to $2,000 a month over time, is sitting at approximately $1.2 million to $1.4 million. Of that, about $280,000 is total contributions. The rest, somewhere around $1 million, is pure compound growth. He has done nothing. He has fielded no phone calls. He has missed 0 weekends. He has been to his daughter's soccer games. All of them. The gap at year 20 is roughly $400,000 to $600,000 in Ryan's favor. And that gap is not from picking better. That gap is from the curve. Compound growth bends upward over long timelines. Real estate doesn't, except through leverage at the moment of purchase, and even that is a one-time boost that loses its compounding power over decades. Here is where the math gets uncomfortable. If Ethan had taken every hour he spent on real estate, valued it at his hourly wage, and invested that money instead, the gap widens by another 6 figures. The opportunity cost of being a landlord is the most expensive line item in real estate, and it doesn't show up on any spreadsheet because nobody tracks it. Real estate wins in specific, identifiable situations. If you live in a market with strong rent-to-price ratios, where rent is at least 0.8 to 1% of the purchase price monthly, the cash flow math actually works on day one. If you're willing to treat real estate as a real business, with systems, screening, CAPEX reserves, and operational discipline, the returns can beat index funds. If you can house hack, the math tilts hard in your favor for the years you live in the property. If you understand 1031 exchanges, depreciation schedules, and bonus depreciation through cost segregation studies, the tax shelter is genuinely powerful, and stocks have no answer for it. But for the median person who buys one property, manages it on weekends, and never optimizes any of the above, the math doesn't favor them. It favors the index fund they didn't buy. The real trap isn't real estate. It isn't index funds. The real trap is choosing one based on which one feels like wealth. Real estate feels like wealth because you can drive past it. Index funds don't feel like anything because there's nothing to drive past. Feelings are not a financial strategy. And if you're wondering what happens when someone runs both strategies in parallel, with leverage on the property side and consistent contributions on the index side, that's a different conversation entirely, and the answer reshuffles everything you just heard. Most of the people who actually build serious wealth don't pick one. They run both, and they let each side do what it's good at. Real estate provides the leverage and the tax shelter. Index funds provide the compounding and the time freedom. The argument was always rigged because the right answer was never just one of them. But for now, the next time someone tells you real estate always wins, or index funds always win, ask them one question. Did you include the time? Because the answer that includes the time is the only honest one.